Hello, I'm Judith Panero, Executive Director for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. It is a pleasure to welcome you to today's virtual discussion. We hope that you, our community of colleagues, allies, and supporters around the globe are healthy and safe. Our offices are in New York, and today I'm speaking to you from Brooklyn, location situated upon the unceded seized territory of the Lenape and Canarsie peoples, and benefited from the economies of slavery and labors of African-descended captives. We owe our existence and vitality to generations from around the world who were brought here against their will, drawn here to escape persecution, and some that have lived on this land for more generations than can be counted. We pay respect to their communities past and present. This acknowledgement asks us each to consider the many legacies of violence, displacement, migration, and settlement that bring us together here today. The systemic violence and racism targeted at Black, Indigenous, and people of color is a harsh reminder of the inequities that persist in our society, particularly by the very institutions meant to protect them. AAMC condemns all violence, bias, aggression, and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, and religion. It is important to listen and learn together, and to also take action to make change a reality. AAMC's commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion, and access will continue to be a driving force of all our efforts. We call upon cultural organizations and the individuals working, funding, and serving them to take action to do better. We are dedicated to an environment in which all individuals are treated with respect and dignity at our programs. Each individual has the right to be in a professional atmosphere that prohibits discriminatory practices, including harassment. Our full code of conduct policy for this webinar and all our programs, as well as the outlets to make direct or anonymous report of violation, has been posted in the chat feature. For many years, we have been presenting virtual programming and documenting live events, all of which are accessible on our website at artcurators.org or our YouTube channel. We hope they provide actionable advice, value, and connectivity. You can also stay up to date on our programming by registering for our communications. We are grateful to all our attendees for making space in their schedule to join us. I also want to acknowledge our members here today and express our gratitude to them for their dedication in being part of our community. We give thanks to our speakers for sharing their experiences and knowledge in today's candid and open forum. Thank you again for joining us. And now to begin our program.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are thrilled to be on with you today. Just as we get started, I know it looks like we have some participants still joining, which is wonderful. The number's ticking up there. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just as we have a presentation to follow along with today so that we can get started. Hopefully everybody can see this okay, PDF version with the cover here. And just to kind of dive right in, we're going to just begin with some introductions as to who we are from Russell Reynolds on the team here today. And I will kick us off. My name's Kat Armstrong. I am based in Boston, Massachusetts with Russell Reynolds and lead our arts and culture practice globally. So I spend virtually all of my time working with museums of different kinds, many of which are art museums of different sizes and scales and areas of focus, but also different types of cultural institutions across the performing arts, multidisciplinary arts organizations, into the sciences, libraries, special collections, zoos, botanical gardens, and beyond. I also studied art history way back when in undergraduate, so have a deep personal love for museums as well, and thrilled to get to be part of the team here to chat with you today. Yenling, can I turn to you next?
Sure, thanks, Kat. Hi, everyone. My name is Yenling Shek, and I am based out of our San Francisco office, but reside in Los Angeles. And I work in our diversity, equity, and inclusion advisory practice. And what that means is I work with organizations across a variety of sectors, including nonprofit, social impact organizations, as well as for-profit institutions, in doing organizational transformation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with cultural organizations in particular, I love that accessibility has been added to that list of DEI. So very happy to join all of you today, and I'll hand it over to Michael.
Hi, everyone. Michael Singleton here with Russell Reynolds. I am a part of our social impact and education practice at the firm based in New York City, but work on a national basis. And partner with Kat and other colleagues on a number of searches in the arts and cultural space, having worked with a number of museums, large and small, independent museums, civic museums, campus-based museums, contemporary art museums, on top curatorial as well as top leadership positions across different functions. So it's a great honor and privilege to be with all of you this afternoon. I've been with Russell Reynolds for about 8 years now. And prior to coming to Russell Reynolds, I worked at a small nonprofit myself, and delighted to dive into the conversation today.
So in terms of our agenda for this afternoon, we have a brief presentation that we'd love to run through. Our topic, of course, today is interviewing, how it's changing, what curators need to know. And so we've thought through as a team a couple of the different aspects of how we see interviews evolving, particularly in thinking about curatorial roles and other museum leadership roles. So we'll talk through a couple of those topics for probably about 20-25 minutes, no more, and then we'll open up and have the rest of the time as a question and answer session. But just to dive right in, this is kind of an overview of some of the topics that we're going to be talking about today. The first is really rethinking positioning, how we think about resume development and thinking about positioning the pitch in the interview itself and how those things are changing. We're going to then talk a little bit about how the actual interview format and the methodologies that we see a lot of art museums using are also changing and growing and flexing, including in this world of virtual interviews, which has been around for a long time now and has certainly taken on a different level of kind of ubiquity during the pandemic, which we think to a certain degree will continue forward. And then we'll talk a little bit about inclusive leadership assessment and some things to be aware of going into interviews with those values in mind. So just to start off, in terms of rethinking positioning, Michael, I'll go ahead and turn it to you to kick us off.
Terrific. Thank you, Kat. So as many of you have probably experienced yourselves, and as you think about other opportunities, either within your own institution or elsewhere, the ways in which curators are being evaluated is changing. And we would encourage you all to think about how you can strategically position yourself in those conversations. So we've broken this down into two parts, thinking about your resume, the materials themselves, and then talking about sort of your pitch, how you make that compelling case to whomever you're speaking with. So thinking about the resume, in our experience working with museum leaders and search committees that may involve board members or other community leaders, I think there is an increasing awareness around the complexity of curatorial projects and efforts. But as we all know, a number of these exhibitions and projects can range significantly in terms of complexity. And I think it's important in the materials themselves to illustrate the nature of that complexity, the scope and scale of some of those projects and exhibitions, to put sort of pen to paper around that information in the material itself. So not leaving that to provide in a voiceover in a conversation, but to really include that in the resume itself. I think that oftentimes curators are humble and don't appreciate and sort of communicate the complexity of that work. And I think that as we look at museum leaders today and the future of museum leadership, we see that question around how to manage complexity, how to manage complex projects, etc., coming up more and more. So to be able to articulate that in the material would be very helpful and advantageous. We also think that the collaborations that you all build within your own institution and externally to really highlight that and make that explicit in the resume itself. Similarly, thinking about fundraising experience, and as every institution is navigating right now, the need for increased funding and financial support often curators play a very significant role in that fundraising effort for specific projects or for the institution more broadly. So sometimes, we've seen curators again leave that to a conversation to include that information and insight. But we really think it's wise to include that information in the resume itself. We would also say that the impact of your exhibitions within your institution and in the community, to put some flavor around that in the resume, because we're often asked, and this is not specific to museums or curatorial, but we're often asked by search committees, hiring committees, or interview panels, what impact has this person had in their own institution or in their community? And that's obviously the big picture frame for lots of hiring discussions and development discussions. So we think it's a good idea to start thinking about how you articulate that even in the material that you present about yourself. And then lastly, in the resume, we think it is smart to highlight where appropriate the opportunities you've had to mentor other staff, other members of your museum or institution. We'll talk about inclusive leadership and mentorship later on in the discussion, but that is incredibly important. And I think there are ways to include that information in the resume that can set you up for success. Pivoting now to talk about the pitch, how you present yourself in a conversation about a new opportunity. I would encourage all of you, as you think about new roles, new opportunities, to present your authentic self and to tailor the summary of your accomplishments to that specific opportunity, to do as much pre-thinking as you can to connect your previous experience specifically to this job description, to make those connections. We also think it is smart to frequently remind yourself to be crisp and concise in those interviews. Don't be afraid to ask or gut check with the person you're speaking with along the way. Am I going into the appropriate level of depth? Would you like me to drill down and provide more information, or should I pick up and speak at a higher altitude? Obviously, in an interview conversation, you won't know how many questions the interviewer has for you or exactly what the format is going to look like. So to be very open and communicative through the process and through the conversation to ensure that you're giving the interviewer the information that they are seeking. And we do find that to be very helpful, and particularly in a virtual environment that can be helpful to bear in mind. We also think it's important and honestly refreshing when candidates are self-aware about their growth areas. It's always a fine balance, right? Where you want to be an advocate for yourself, and you want to really sell your strengths and make that compelling case to whomever you're speaking with about the opportunity. But it's also very important to reflect and introspect around your growth areas. If you were to step into this role, where are you going to need support from this person you're speaking with or other members of the team in order to be successful in the role? And that type of insight and thinking and communication goes a long way in helping the interview panel or the person you're speaking with understand really what it would be like for you to step into this role and what that working relationship could look like. So not to be afraid about articulating and really being clear about those growth areas and how you would want to be supported in that role to understand that fit and potential. And then lastly, we would encourage you to emphasize your passion for this work and not lose sight of that. It's often easy in an interview setting to become so focused on the preparation and to think about the job itself and the different facets of whatever that opportunity might be. And sometimes what's lost is that passion, right? Why are you doing this work? What animates and energizes you about this? And I think that is, it's important to keep that top of mind as you go through any interview process at each step of the way. That will carry you and propel you regardless of the format or the twists and turns in interview conversations. So with that, I'll turn it back to Kat so we can continue moving through the agenda. But hopefully that helps you all think about how to position yourselves in interview conversations, given what we've seen in terms of hiring panels and search committees evaluating people coming from curatorial type positions or thinking about other curatorial roles.
Thanks, Michael. And I just wanted to acknowledge as well, thank you for those who may be starting to share questions in the Q&A. If it's all right, we're going to kind of toggle through the different parts of the presentation, and then we'll love to circle back to those questions. So please keep those coming, and I promise that we will address those as we get to that part of the agenda today. So just continuing on, we wanted to spend a couple of minutes talking about how the actual kind of format of interviews, the methodologies that we see organizations using are changing, and how that might help you think about preparing for interviews at different levels within museums and within organizations. So a couple of pieces that we wanted to touch on today. One of the kind of big changes that we're seeing is, I would say, this real focus on what we would call kind of competency-based interviewing as a format. And what that means is that, again, there are questions or changes in terms of how questions are being asked that are less about just kind of the detail of, for example, exhibitions that you're working on right now or that you've done, publications, expertise and track record. We'll talk a little bit about how we're seeing those topics be kind of probed in interviews in a minute. But we're seeing a lot of organizations, both art museums, multidisciplinary arts organizations, and all other kinds of, I think, nonprofits and social impact organizations, evolve to asking types of questions that are really focused around kind of skills and experiences broadly defined for the role. And in many cases, those are really shifting to be inclusive of not just kind of exhibitions and scholarly track record, but also topics around how one manages a team, how one works with a team, kind of what leadership has meant in the different roles that you've held to you, what motivates you, why you do the work that you do. Again, as Michael mentioned, particularly as one moves into roles where management might be a bigger part of the equation, perhaps a chief curator role or on from there, fundraising is something that we see a lot of organizations evaluate. And so a couple of things to expect, I think, in this type of a format that's more focused on competencies. I think it's fair to expect that a lot of interviewers will probe and kind of ask for, with open-ended questions, specific examples to understand exactly the approach that you have taken in different circumstances. And we're going to look at some sample questions in a minute as well to explore that. But they're really trying to get a sense less of kind of hypothetical approaches, kind of how you think about your theory of practice, and really more specific examples to anchor the experience that you have with whatever competency they're exploring that would give them confidence in your ability to do that at their institution. Similarly, I think it's fair to expect that a lot of interviewers with this more kind of competency-based interviewing approach will really seek examples both of successes and setbacks or failures that you might have experienced to probe around what you have learned through those times when things haven't gone well and how you've applied those lessons. So again, going back to that kind of self-awareness piece, we do see a lot of organizations probing around both the positive and things that have been challenges and what you've learned. Another major evolution, I think, in recent years, and of course, tremendously so over the past year during the pandemic, is just the rise of virtual interviews. And I think that we've seen that interviews are, of course, always going to be a critical part of the hiring process, and we feel they can be conducted effectively in a virtual environment. They were, I think, before the pandemic, but particularly over the last year plus, Most interviews have been happening virtually. Maybe at the very finalist stage, there is an opportunity for a socially distant in-person interaction. And even as, we hope that over the coming year, we will have the ability to engage more in person again. Travel might be more of a possibility. We do expect that there will be long-term impacts, that a lot of organizations have really felt the efficiency and the efficacy of virtual interviews, and will continue to manage a lot of hiring and interview processes virtually. So we think that's something that's here to stay up until maybe when one has a really serious or kind of finalist pool of candidates in lots of different types of searches. So we've put in here, just to kind of give you a sense of some case study type ideas of what we mean when we talk about these kind of competency-based interview questions. These are just some examples put in kind of a couple of different categories. On the left-hand side, different types of questions that we see organizations use to probe around the topics of expertise in a way that move beyond just asking you to describe kind of what exhibitions you've done, what you focused on, maybe what publications were associated. We're seeing a lot of organizations really want to probe around how the work that you've done really reflects your inventive and kind of creative talents. What aspects of projects that you've worked on have challenged you as a curator, and what you've learned from those experiences. What you see as some of the most innovative programs or exhibitions that you've developed, and why, what the outcome was. Helping understand a sense of context, the nature of kind of your connectivity to colleagues across the field in different ways. What you see as, and I would put these questions in kind of the category of perspective on the state of the field, how you see the field changing, where you see the field going, what are important considerations that you think are critical in developing exhibitions for a museum like the one you might be interviewing at, or an organization like the one you might be interviewing at. And then really understanding what aspects of their collections, if it's a collecting institution or programs, really connect with the interests that have shaped your career. Similarly, on the right-hand side here, we see a lot of organizations really wanting to explore these other competencies beyond expertise. And those can touch on topics like kind of thinking about strategy, thinking about management style. The second question here is one we often see organizations use, or something like this, which says, have you had a review from colleagues? What do you see as kind of your management style? What feedback have you gotten? How have you responded to those types of feedback? Again, different types of questions that might be asked around how you've participated in fundraising processes and in kind of cultivation. It might not be at the senior leadership level, but how you've had a window into kind of how that fundraising and cultivation process works, maybe on acquisitions or in other ways. Focused on collaboration, how you've built effective collaborative partnerships with colleagues in your institution, maybe across the institution or beyond. And again, asking for this sense of kind of vision and perspective on the field, where you see museums like the one you might be interviewing with going in future. So we see a lot of organizations probing around these different kind of types of competencies increasingly in interviews. And then lastly, we've put in here just a couple of kind of tips and techniques, and these may be well known to all of you all, particularly after a year of all being on Zoom together all the time. But in an interview context, there's a couple of things which feel like they might be obvious, but that sometimes aren't, that actually can make a big difference. Testing technology in advance. Making sure that you have good lighting and an appropriate background, which can of course just be a virtual background. And in many cases, that's a really nice thing to recommend. It's always very neutral. Thinking about where the camera is on the device to be able to have a sense of eye contact as opposed to looking at a different screen. Being mindful of body language, minimizing distractions, amping up enthusiasm, which is to say, it's really hard to think about body language and communicating enthusiasm on Zoom. In a Zoom interview, we're missing that important moment where you get to walk into a room and shake someone's hand and have small talk and kind of set the tone and the vibe for the conversation. So thinking about ways to bring some of that energy into the virtual room and virtual interview are wonderful. And in terms of, again, a couple of the pieces here, we think about these in broad categories of just making sure that you feel like the logistics in order so that none of those things end up becoming distractions during the interview, and making sure that you set the right tone. And one piece here that we wanted to just touch on, and this is kind of in line with something that Michael was saying, it's really easy, we find in virtual interviews, to kind of go on both sides, interviewer and interviewee, because it's really hard to have those body language clues you might get in person of, oh gosh, maybe I'm going into a little bit too much detail here, or maybe I misunderstood the intent of the question. So we recommend just putting that right out on the table, acknowledging that, you know, virtual interactions lack some of those common cues, and saying, please feel free to tell me if you want me to slow down, you know, speed up. If I misunderstood the intent of the question, just inviting that feedback as you go can be a really nice way to set that nice collaborative tone. So those are some tips and techniques around virtual interviewing. And just wrapping up the presentation phase, Yenling, can I turn to you to talk a little bit about inclusive leadership and how we're seeing that evolve in an interview context?
Yes. Thanks, Kat. Yes. So, you know, with this portion, what I really wanted to do is just prepare all of you as you think through how you talk about the type of curator you want to be when it comes to DEIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. And so I've outlined 3 overarching steps, I think, that are important for you to consider. So one is this process of reflection. I think, as Michael and Kat both said, this need to be self-aware is so crucial moving forward. And that becomes even more important to topics around DEIA. So take the time now, you know, even before you're applying for a job, what are some of your own personal experiences that shape your approach around who you want to be in terms of an inclusive curator? So this means, you know, are there things about your upbringing, relationships that you have with different community members, right? Like, draw from those personal experiences, because with these questions that Michael and Catherine are alluding to, people are looking for concrete examples. And so you do want to make sure you take that time to do the work of reflection. So in addition to personal experiences, what are some of the formal training pieces that you've done? So what training have you received that shapes your ability to promote diverse, equitable, inclusive, and accessible art, right? Are there opportunities where you've spent a lot of time studying community art that is different from the communities that you are a member of, right? And that's important to be able to articulate. What are your gaps in experience? And this is where the growth areas that Michael talked about earlier become really important. What are some of those blind spots? What are the things that maybe you aren't as familiar with that perhaps you need to build more experience in, gain more knowledge, seek out training opportunities, so that you can be a DEIA intentioned curator? Right. And so after you go through this process of reflection, then really take the time to develop those skill sets, that set of knowledge, that set of experience, right? And so a lot of the museums that are working, like, they're going to be paying very much attention to the local community, right? So even knowing, like, well, what is the makeup of the community? How do you become involved and connect with different community arts organizations? You know, and there are a number of community arts organizations as well as artists wherever you're located. And it's a way of connecting with them. And during this pandemic, you have opportunities to do that through Zoom. So even if you weren't able to attend something in person now, you can attend it virtually and learn so much more about what's out there, who's out there, right? Who are the artists to watch out for? And that use those opportunities to really learn from people, understand from different communities how they view collaboration, because collaboration will look very differently based off of that community. You know, in some communities, being really connected with the elders are incredibly important. You know, in other communities, it's like, no, we need to be involved from the ground up, from the moment you brainstorm all the way through the setup. And I think that traditional models of collaboration and exhibitions no longer work when people are so focused on making sure that community voices are being heard, being reflected, and that they're being empowered even, right? And this gets to the relevance and accessibility of art that has become vital these days. And so, with that, be intentional about exploring different community engagement models. What does that look like? And I do recommend really unpacking that, right? Like, what does it look like for communities of different socioeconomic statuses? What does it look like for communities with different abilities? What does that look like in the deaf community? What does that look like in the blind community? How does art play out, based off of different religion? There are pockets. There are community arts pockets, in each of these communities. And have you tapped into it? Do you know? Are you in the know? And I think this is your opportunity to get in the know. And then lastly, as you're going through these efforts, prepare, like really think through these concrete examples that Michael and Kat are encouraging you to have at the ready, right? So think about some detailed examples that you can share that speak to your personal commitment to DI, right? Like what have you done personally? And think through what is the actual organizational rationale. So a lot of the work that I do in doing trainings around inclusive leadership is helping leaders speak to multiple audiences. So there are going to be people who will really be moved by the heart, like that motivation, that personal motivation. And there are going to be people who really need to understand, like, what's the business rationale? Like, why is this an organizational imperative for me? Can't I just keep my traditional audience? Why do I need to pay attention to DEIA, right? And if this is something that's really important to you, be sure that you are able to speak to that lens as well. And think through what is your approach? What is your framework, right? So some of the competency questions that Kat shared earlier are about, how do you think? People want to understand how you think. Do you have a philosophy? Do you have a framework? Like, what are you drawing from that will make DEI come to life in your position as a curator? So, also be prepared to think through how you want to continue your learning. This is not going to be a one-stop kind of, you've arrived kind of moment, right? DEIA is ever evolving, dynamic, and you want to think through how you're going to continue to stay on the cusp of this and stay relevant, because really this is the future when we talk about art and communities moving forward. And so with that, I'll hand it back to Kat to help lead our Q&A time.
Thanks, Yen-Ling. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the screen share just so everyone can see faces a little bit bigger. And I think what we'll do, if it works for everyone on the line, is just kind of go through the questions that have been shared in the question and answer framework, and we'll kind of take them one by one. And if there's other follow-ups, please feel free to put them in that Q&A. So one of the first questions was around providing some case studies of successful ways to describe one's kind of growth areas. And maybe I'll just start off on this, and then team would love your input as well. I think a lot of the reality of how we often encourage organizations to think about evaluating is thinking about kind of capability and capacity. So if fundraising is an example, you might not have been in a position of doing a lot of fundraising yet. So it's not really helpful for the person interviewing you to say, have you led a capital campaign or done this kind of big major donor fundraising? So how often people are getting at those types of questions is, tell us about the experiences that you've had that would kind of give you the capacity to grow in this area. And I use that as an example because I think it speaks to how you might also frame answers to those questions about your own growth areas. You might say in that context, well, I want to be candid. I haven't been in a position of being the one doing the majority of major donor asks for my institution. And that's an area where I think I could use support. Here are the ways in which I've had other experiences that demonstrate my capacity to grow in that area. And then I'm ready to kind of step to that next level, as well as being candid about where you might need support. I think similar, realities can be said in terms of management. Obviously, in a lot of organizations at different kind of curatorial levels, you won't have been in a position yet to be managing big teams. But often on exhibitions, you're managing really complex project teams. And so, you might say in an answer to those questions around kind of team management scope and scale, I want to be candid, X is the size of the team that I'm managing on projects right now. I might not have kind of direct reports, and that might be an area, again, where I have room to grow. But here are the different ways in which I've kind of demonstrated that ability to kind of manage complexity, to mentor others, to collaborate, to think about, complex project management towards deadlines, delegating to others, that, give that confidence that I'm ready to step up to the next level. Michael and Yenling, anything you'd add on that question about kind of describing one's growth areas?
No, I think you captured it perfectly, Kat. I think that it's also certainly appropriate to describe how you've been working on that growth area, and to to name the growth area, and also anticipate the question. So, what have you been doing to address that, right? And I think that is incredibly helpful on many different levels for the interviewer to understand that level of self-awareness, and also that proactive orientation to thinking about your own growth and development.
And I would just say, maybe to wrap up before we move on to the next question, one of the things that we often hear when we're doing searches at all different levels, whether it's a curator, a chief curator, deputy director, director, is when someone's really honest and kind of self-aware of the things that maybe they haven't had as much experience with. Usually we find that the interviewer finds that very refreshing, because they want to get a sense of how they also will want to support you to be successful. And when there is that self-awareness of, this isn't something that I've done as much of, I feel like I'm ready to take this step because of these other experiences, but I recognize I'm going to need some support there. Usually people respond to that really well, rather than hearing a sense of, maybe I've never done this before, but I have no concerns. That can be a little bit of a red flag. So I think that self-awareness is a good thing to bring authentically into an interview. The next question was, how do we explain when we're managing up or functioning beyond our official title without seeming boastful or ungrateful? Yenling or Michael, do you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off here. And I think it's a great question, because I think the last thing you want to do in an interview is come across as, right, ungrateful or negative about the people you're working with. You obviously want to be very professional and positive. I think that there is a way, however, to describe managing up as a part of every job, right? Your CEO or executive director manages up to the board, and you manage up to. When we think about management, really from a 360 perspective, there's managing up, there's managing across, with your peers, and also managing down, people who may report directly into you. And that is not meant to be sort of pejorative or anything, but just to think about the structures of management. And so I think that I would encourage you to speak about, managing up in a way that really captures the partnership of your perspective on the team to help the leadership understand perhaps a broader context that they may not have visibility or line of sight into because of their role. Whereas in your position, you may be more directly connected to whatever whatever initiative or project you may be referring to. And I think that the opportunity to talk about how you function beyond your official title is actually a great idea. I think that we often hear the interview question, tell us what's not on the page. What have you done that maybe didn't initially fall into your job description? And I think that to the extent that you can tie those experiences where you have proactively sought out other responsibilities, or lent a helping hand, or pitched in on other projects across the institution to help a broader institutional goal or priority, that is additive and very positive. I think that would be well received by the person you're interviewing with. So it's certainly about the framing, the examples that you provide, and the tone in which you offer those examples. That would be my my suggestion for that question.
Great. So the next question is about how in an interview you balance the need to sell yourself completely with the need to find out if it's actually the right job for you. And there was a really helpful comment, which I think we can all resonate with, of sometimes finding that we focus so much on kind of convincing the institution, I am the right person for you, that we've kind of sold ourselves into a job that then we realize, well, gosh, maybe this isn't the right fit for me. Yenling, do you want to start off on that one?
I mean, I would actually reframe it all together, right? I see people and jobs as matches. I don't think that it's helpful for us as people and as humans to see ourselves as selling ourselves for a job. And it really is about being able to bring our authentic selves to work and knowing that we are in an organization that is aligned with our values, with our goals, with what we want to do with our profession. And so I would definitely say, you know, be very clear about the kind of culture you want to be a part of when you interview for jobs. You know, I think that sometimes it can feel like I just need to get something and, you know, but you could get something and be absolutely miserable because it was not what you had imagined, either in terms of the responsibilities, the hierarchy, the culture of the organization, your supervisor. So given your own, what you know about yourself through past jobs or past projects you've been on, what will be key to you being successful and growing in a job? Be clear about that, write that down, and turn them into questions. Turn them into questions so that when you go into the interview, they're interviewing you and you bring your full and authentic self into the space to say, this is what I can contribute, this is who I am. And at the end, you turn the tables. People will always ask you, what questions do you have for us? And people really genuinely want you to ask questions. When you don't, that's actually a bigger red flag than if you had questions prepared. So if you have questions prepared, it shows that you've done your homework. It shows that you are serious, right? You're putting in the effort. So I would think about it in that way. Think about, is this job going to be what I want it to be, right? Am I going to have the impact that I want to have? Am I going to be doing the work that I want to do? And are these the people that I want to work with? Is this an organization I can get behind? Because otherwise it can be very challenging, I would say.
So we had a couple questions that we might kind of answer together. One was around the comments of adding details to the resume. How much is too much? Can the letter of interest bear some of the weight? And then we had another question around how long should CVs or resumes and cover letters be? Because there's often so much in the position description, but you kind of can't touch on everything. And how do you kind of present impact, qualitative versus quantitative, on a resume or CV? So let's kind of take those together, if we will, and maybe I'll just kind of start us off. I think on kind of how much detail is too much detail. I think you want a resume to be pretty quickly digestible. So I would not recommend kind of long form paragraphs going into lots of kind of descriptive detail about things. I think that bullet points that share information, but information kind of thought inclusively, is a really good way to go. And what we mean by that is a lot of kind of I would say an older school format, particularly more academically driven true CVs, might be just a line list of professional titles, and then a line list of educational qualifications, and then pages and pages of publications and exhibitions and other kind of associated, you know, kind of achievements in those ways. I think we're seeing a lot of organizations, well, they want to know that detail of kind of rigor from an exhibition and publication perspective, being interested in seeing a lot more detail fleshed out in the top section around the professional experiences. So not just a list of organization, title, and dates, but a sense of scope of role in each of those. Kind of who did you report to? Was there a team reporting up through you? What types of projects were you managing? What were the scale of those projects? What was the budget that you managed? What was the team that you were managing on an exhibition, even if it wasn't kind of direct reports to you? And impact, again, in the institution. what were kind of, when you think back on how you would describe your, influence, the lasting legacy that you're leaving with the place, how would you articulate that? What are some of those points of impact? But I think you want to keep it fairly short and sweet in terms of kind of the prose, to focus on the detail as opposed to the description. Generally speaking, I think for a resume, which is focused on kind of professional qualifications and kind of high level detail, 2 to 3 pages is a good ballpark, depending a little bit on career stage. If you're doing a fully fleshed out academic CV, which a lot of organizations do want for curatorial roles, then I think having longer, kind of appendices with kind of publication track record and exhibitions are appropriate. But I would think about kind of limiting that. It doesn't need to necessarily be every single one that you've ever done. And I would kind of know your audience. If you're talking to a museum on a higher education campus, and you're going to be interviewing with faculty, they're going to pay a lot of attention to those publications. If it's a different kind of institution, those details might not be as critical to flesh out in pages. So there's no, I would say, for an academic CV kind of hard and fast rule, but I think if you're getting above 10 pages, that starts to get a little long. That's a lot of detail to go through, and keeping the kind of summary section up front around real professional qualifications, educational details and accomplishments, 2 to 3 pages, I would say is a good ballpark to consider. And then on the point about, can the letter of interest bear some of the weight? Absolutely. I think maximum 2 pages for a letter of interest is a good, again, ballpark. Beyond that, and I think it can get a little bit too detailed. But I think also in the letter framing motivation, the why as much as the what of what you have done are good things to bear in mind.
And I would also just add to what Kat was suggesting. As you think about your materials, your resume in particular, you want to make sure that the document itself is clear, and that someone who may not yet have had the opportunity to connect with you can see that document and pretty quickly understand the narrative and the story that you're trying to tell. So oftentimes in this desire to include as much information as possible, we've seen resumes that are candidly crowded, and it's hard to digest, right? You all are so accomplished, and so to really think about and sort of provide that, use that editing eye to think about what is most important and how can I articulate the roles that I've played within my institutions, the impact that I've had, and make sure that is clear and not buried, across so much information that someone really has to work at the document to really get at. So that would also be, I think, hopefully a helpful piece of advice.
I would just add on that, I get a lot of questions around, should I kind of design my resume? Should I make it visually really distinctive and totally stand out? And that's not a bad thing to think about. But again, I would say only go that direction to the point where it's still really clear to kind of navigate the data. Sometimes I think overly designed visual resumes actually kind of bury the lead, and it can be hard to figure out the kind of career trajectory or actually figure out the details. So I think clarity of information really is the most important thing, more than kind of design. So the next question is a great one about recruiter queries. So if you're contacted by a recruiter and you're kind of reasonably sure that you're not interested in the position, is it better to talk to the recruiter anyway and risk wasting their time, or to decline to talk to them and risk sending the signal that you're not interested in future opportunities? Great question. I would say kind of recommendation, as we are in this position on the other end all the time, is I think clarity around whether you're interested. If you really know that it's not for you, I would say in the email, my gut is this one probably isn't right for me, but I would love to be helpful. Can we hop on the phone and talk through recommendations? I think it's good to take the call, because if you're starting to think about other opportunities, it's good to be on the recruiter's radar. It's good for them to understand a sense of what kinds of things might be more interesting to you to consider than the one that they've reached out about. And having that FaceTime or, on Zoom or on the phone to be top of mind is never going to be a bad thing. I don't think that that's going to be wasting their time. And if you might have one or two suggestions to share, that's really valuable and is, I think a big part of a lot of the outreach that we do is getting recommendations and ideas as much as it's exploring interest. If you're not sure if it's of interest, then I think definitely hop on the phone and you can just be candid. I'm not sure if this is right for me. Wanted to at least have a conversation to explore it, but I think candor is a good way to go. All right, the next question was any advice for interviewing for internal positions? Great question. Michael or Yenling, do either one of you want to lead off on that one?
No, I'm happy to lead off. So I would say for internal positions, it's smart to really think of yourself as an external candidate. As strange as that may sound, I think that for internal hiring, the people that you work with, depending on what the position is, right? If it's within your department or if it's another department that you need to help, someone sort of understand your role, perhaps. But I think what you want to do is help the hiring manager sort of see you in the same way that they see external candidates. So to the extent that that person may not be as familiar with your work prior to your current institution or what you've done outside of work, that can be a useful opportunity to paint that picture, to tell that story. And I think that a good interviewer will ask the same questions of internal as well as external candidates to ensure that integrity of process, and recognizing that you as an internal candidate will know more the ins and outs about the institution because of your current role. So I think that, again, this ties back to what we were talking about earlier in terms of self-awareness, to really name where those areas that given the goals of the institution or some of the dynamics, that you can step in and hit the ground running, and then also really think about where that this will be a stretch for you, and to talk about how you anticipate stepping into the role, I think can be really helpful.
Yeah, I really like what Michael said about treating yourself as an external candidate, because I think one of the biggest shortcomings I see happen with internal candidates is they take for granted that it's still a formal interview and treat it way more casually than it should be treated. So treat it with the level of formality and respect as you would as an external candidate. Do not take anything for granted. Just be explicit in your examples and treat everyone formally. I think that would be my biggest piece of advice.
So the next question is, again, on the kind of resume piece, how to get some of those details and flavor into a CV, which is so formulaic and doesn't have room for kind of a bio or kind of job description language. And my gut is there's no need for a resume to be overly formulaic. I think the resume is there for you to communicate whatever data you want to communicate relative to that specific job. So I always encourage people to look back at the job description, particularly if there's kind of a candidate profile section that highlights, the competencies that they're really prioritizing or the experiences they're really prioritizing, and make sure you touch on those. Not that you need to hit every one of them, because likely you won't, but whatever are the experiences that you've had that, again, demonstrate your capacity to do those things, even if they are a growth area, and put those data points in. And again, it doesn't necessarily need to be kind of long form descriptions, but I think you should feel free to include those kinds of details and those flavors that are maybe not as focused on just kind of exhibitions or publications or those really tangible things, but some of the more behind the scenes aspects that touch more on kind of leadership or management or kind of motivation, the outcomes, those types of things. I think you should feel free to put that in. I would say on the bio question, sometimes we do see people include a kind of high level bio at the top of a resume. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do, but often it does. I think we see people feel like those can be a little bit redundant to the detail in the resume. So I would be kind of selective in terms of what you're doing there, and think about having maybe more of those kind of bio type details, maybe the kind of adjectives, the descriptors, tailored towards the job description language in the letter of interest or cover letter. So the next question is about the kind of curatorial exhibit portfolio. What is the role of those, or kind of advice for creating one? Michael, do you want to take that one?
Happy to. So I would say, again, it depends on the role that you're interviewing for in terms of what materials have been requested, or what you might want to share. I would encourage you to think along the same lines as the resume. This is sort of a highlight reel, right? An opportunity to give someone a sense of, the highlights of your work and that portfolio. So I do think it's often very helpful to provide that as an addendum to other materials. And we've often seen candidates use that to great success. I think, again, having worked with different organizations that have different approaches about that, and sort of where in the process that might be appropriate, I would just encourage you all to ask as you apply for, or put your candidacy forward for a position, to ask if it would be appropriate to share that information at this time, or perhaps is that later in the process to put together that portfolio to share. So I think it's a great idea.
Sorry, I was on mute. The next question was around giving some tips of how to manage a panel interview. What should the follow-up be post-interview, and email to everyone? Awesome question. And I think that you'll find that for a lot of roles, particularly as you kind of are thinking about perhaps more kind of senior leadership roles, senior curator, chief curator, and then more administrative leadership roles, if that's a direction that you're interested in taking, often we'll have panel interviews. It's pretty typical. And I think a couple things to be prepared for. One is, often a panel interview will feel very structured. In other words, different people on the panel will actually likely have kind of pre-assigned questions or pre-assigned topics that they will be asking. And that's not because they are super rigid and formal necessarily. They could be, but I wouldn't take that as a for sure signal of that. It usually is because they want to make sure that every person on the panel has the chance to ask a question and interact with you. And in particular, because they want to make sure that they cover the same topics with each candidate. So I think it's fair to ask, you might not get all the answers, but it's fair to ask in advance, of course, who is going to be on the panel, if they might be able to share background, at least kind of title, where they are in the organization, so you can do some of your own research to know who's going to be there. And whether you're working with an HR person or a recruiter, ask if they can share with you any insight into some of the kind of types of questions or topics that are really top of mind for the search committee. They probably won't share a list of questions, but they might share with you, again, some details about the format. Are they going to be doing more of a competency-based interviewing format like I described earlier? Are there other things that are kind of most important to them? They might help you have some really good context with which to prepare for that kind of a panel style interview. And I would suggest, as we talked about in terms of questions, often in that kind of panel context, it's a lot to cover in what might be an hour, 75 minutes, hour and a half long interview. So they might just have 10 to 15 minutes for you to ask questions at the end. Have a couple of questions prepared. It can be exhausting after the end of an hour-long panel interview. And sometimes when they turn it to you, you're just exhausted and you can draw a blank. So having a couple of questions kind of ready to go to be able to ask are great. And I would say, to the point about managing a panel interview, that point about crispness that Michael made, because often with a whole panel, every person is going to ask a question, and a lot of panels or search committees are pretty big. It's a lot of topics to cover. So I think erring on the side of being crisp and saying, did I answer the question? Should I go deeper there? to give the panel the opportunity to keep the conversation moving along so they don't miss any topics is a good thing to think about. And post-interview, I think an email either to everyone or to your point of contact to share with everyone on your behalf is a great way to go. I don't think it needs to be within 15 minutes, within 48 hours, I think is totally fine. But I think a nice thank you note to follow up. Again, you don't need to sleuth and find every person's email address, but to whomever your point of contact is to share with the panel is always a really nice touch. All right, next question is around advice for those re-entering the field after pursuing a doctorate, in particular in which you focused on DEIA advocacy in the arts and research, but lack recent exhibition projects. Michael, Yenling, you want to take the lead on that one?
Oh, I defer to the two of you.
No, I think, so I would say I would encourage you to talk about what you have focused on in your doctoral program and how that has either clarified or sharpened your thinking about what you want to be doing next, and sort of apply that, because it's such an amazing accomplishment, and to be able to apply that then to sort of re-entry into the field, to talk about how you would weave together that experience with your previous experience to then move forward in terms of your own professional career. I think that's absolutely appropriate, and recognize that you may lack those recent exhibition projects that someone who's been more active in the field, for the past few years may bring. So I don't think that will be used against you in any way. I think it's just important to weave together the doctorate experience with your previous exhibition experience, so that everything is seen together sort of in one package and what you would bring to the role.
All right, the next question, how early in the interview process can one bring up quote unquote deal breakers? For example, flexible hours, salary, benefits, title, all those good things. And I would say there's kind of a couple of different stages where I would say getting into more and more detail around those kind of aspects, which are perhaps less about kind of what the job is and more about the circumstances of the job and whether that makes it doable or not. I think on the kind of salary piece, I think generally speaking, having a sense of compensation expectations early in the process is a good thing. A general rule of, I think, kind of practice for us in a lot of searches and hiring processes is try to have no surprises. So I think to make sure that if there is any question, that you're kind of in the right ballpark in terms of salary expectations. And I use that word very intentionally, not about your current salary, but around your expectations moving into a new role, and making sure that, again, you're kind of in the right ballpark so that there's no big surprises either on your end or on the recruiter's end, on the HR partner's end later on is a good thing. I don't think you need to get super specific. And frankly, a lot of HR partners and recruiters might not share with you an exact specific range, because it's going to be dependent on experience, based on how the candidate pool kind of pans out for a certain role. But I think getting a sense of ballpark is good to do early on. In terms of title, I think that that's something which should be explored very early on. It should be pretty clear based on the job description. But I think that will have all sorts of implications in terms of course, salary, benefits, how much time you're expected to be in person, although all of those realities are probably going to be evolving over the coming years in any case. Will be changing. But I think that some of the more detailed aspects of kind of logistics around kind of benefits and flex hours really are probably more appropriate for a little bit later on in the conversation. And part of that is the slight chicken and egg of, if an organization really wants you, there might be more room for flexibility on some of those things than if it's something that's raised really early in the process and they don't yet know that you are the person that they really want. So I wouldn't brush anything under the rug. I think if it is raised in the conversation proactively by the recruiter or the HR partner, it's good to get those things out on the table. But for some of the really tactical aspects that are more about kind of benefits, which include, I think, flexible work arrangements, I think those are more appropriate for a little bit later in the conversation. And typically, again, if you're going to have kind of a panel interview and then you have an HR person who's your day-to-day point of contact, those kind of detailed questions about salary, benefits, flexible work, usually are I would recommend going into those with the HR person, not with kind of a full panel. I would use that time with the full panel to think about more of the kind of big picture strategic questions around priorities, those types of things. All right, the next question was around a situation in which someone's most recent supervisor is unfortunately not a great supporter, and feeling like you have to list this person at the top of your references, but worrying that they won't be the best reference. Is there anything I can do to kind of mitigate that in the hiring process besides listing others who will sing my praises much better? Michael Yenling, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off here, Kat, and also would love for you to chime in with thoughts, because I think it's such a great question. And I would say it's important for you to speak with everyone that you provide as a reference ahead of time, to ask them, are they comfortable speaking as a reference on your behalf? What types of things would they highlight in a conversation with a recruiter or a hiring manager? Because it's important to understand that person's perspective. And I do think that we're also seeing more and more of this, where organizations want to speak with people who've worked with you from a variety of different perspectives, and they want a candid view. They want to understand how to support you in this role to be successful. If you reach the point in the process where an organization is taking formal references, that tends to be far enough into the process where they are enthusiastic about you, right? And trying to understand the full picture of what it is like to work with you. So I think that, yes, you can, you could think about a former supervisor, not the most recent supervisor. If there's someone else who has worked with you from that perspective, who could provide that supervisory point of view, that may be a nice sort of substitute for that individual. And then also just thinking about, really, is this person going to give you a negative review, or is this person going to give a fair sort of, more even review? And does that type of feedback, is that going to help or hurt you? And just to be really thoughtful about that. And I would encourage you to have that conversation with the individual who you're thinking about.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add to that is just have an answer prepared. If people ask you, if you end up not putting your most recent supervisor and they're like, oh, we noticed you didn't put your recent supervisor, have a ready answer, and be as tactful as you can.
Mm-hmm.
Great point, Emily.
Just keeping an eye to the clock as we have about 6 minutes. I saw one question kind of on that topic, which is a super easy answer around at what point in the interview process are references usually contacted? And just to answer that pretty quickly, usually it's pretty far on. So we usually don't start calling references until someone is kind of a semi-finalist for the role. So when it's down to maybe 3 to 4 candidates, and then usually when it's down to 1 to 2 real finalist candidates is when you go deeper in the full kind of 360-degree referencing. So usually it's pretty far along in the process. And just trying to think, we've got 5 other good questions. I know we're going to not have time for them all. So maybe 2 that we'll try to tackle. One, which I think is a really great question, which comes up a lot, is around this question of most arts professionals wanting to move up. And suppose you're at the stage of your career where you realize you really enjoy the curatorial work more than the management and leadership responsibilities. that you've had? How should you communicate that when applying for jobs for which you feel overqualified, but know you'd be perfectly happy to take on? This is a great, great question. And I think it's something which I have to say, as recruiters, we really appreciate candor. Often, people in curatorial roles are recommended, for example, for directorships or deputy directorships. And it's not a role that would make them happy. It's not what they want to do. It's not something that plays to kind of their passions, their strengths, what gets you out of bed in the morning. And I think in many cases, particularly for those senior management roles, the boards or the CEO, the director, the biggest fear is pulling someone into a role that actually isn't well suited to what drives their motivation in their work. And so I think we're seeing a lot of, we find clients for us, or us as recruiters, really appreciating that candor when someone says, you know what, I really want to stay a curator. This is what I love. This is what drives my motivation to be in this work and in this field and in my practice. And I'd love to stay in touch around other curatorial roles that might come up, but I just want to be candid that I don't think I want to be a director or a deputy director or, what have you. So I would be really candid about that. And I think it's an easier thing, to be fair, to communicate on, on an individual basis, one-to-one, than in writing. But I would say just be totally upfront about it. I think that that's a really good self-awareness to have, and something that we see a lot of people really appreciate in a hiring process. And then another one, which I would love to just touch on in our couple final minutes, is around the role of jockeying, I think was the word that was used. As recruiters, individuals often ask about leveraging their networks towards advocating on their behalf to a client one is seeking to join, e.g. the role of jockeying. What is your advice on kind of the pros and cons on that issue? And I would just say, maybe super briefly, do that very judiciously and not too much. So we find, a competitive hiring process is one where an organization, often with a panel of individuals, as we've described, is evaluating kind of a field of candidates and want to have the optionality to go through that evaluation in a rigorous, thoughtful, and inclusive way that feels right for the organization, and as is their mandate, to choose the person that is best. And often that kind of jockeying or campaigning, in my experience, can kind of backfire. It can feel like, this person is trying to kind of circumvent the process of the panel or the committee, and it can be taken, I think, out of context pretty easily. What I would say is, offer up those points of connection. So often when we're working with a candidate, they might say, at the right time, I have close connections with these 4 people who have a relationship to this institution. I'd love for you to call them as references to speak on my behalf. That's awesome. And that goes beyond a reference list. That's a great way to triangulate. You might offer that members of the panel, the hiring committee, could call those individuals depending on the structure of the hiring process. But I think that that we see received much better by hiring committees than the kind of external campaigning and jockeying, which can put a hiring panel in a tricky position, particularly if it's other kind of senior colleagues in the field, or maybe donors, board members, things like that. If they feel like members of the community are campaigning on behalf of someone, it can put undue pressure on the committee in a way that doesn't always, I think, have a great impact on one's candidacy.
Yeah, I'll put a pin on that one. It actually goes against equity and equitable practices, because what it will do is it will enhance all of the social capital that people already have to get positions, and leaves out people who do not have access to that same network. And so a lot of what we advise organizations is to put into place a standardized process, basically everything Kat just outlined. And if you do that, just know that, if you do something that is very much an explicit campaign of leveraging your networks, you are inherently creating an inequitable process in that job. And that will not feel very good, I think, for the people who you end up working with, if they learn that that's the case. So think about the culture that you're going to be setting up and the example that you're setting, even throughout the job process.
All right, we are at 1:44, and I know we want to end right on time. So shall we go ahead and wrap?
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time. We so much appreciate. We're going to go ahead and turn off our video and sound. But thank you all for your time and for your participation and great questions.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Monica Valenzuela, Program Manager for AAMC and AAMC Foundation. Thank you for joining our program today, and a special thanks to our speakers for sharing their experience and expertise with us. A recording will be available on our website, artcurators.org, and our YouTube channel shortly. Please help support our capacity to continue programs such as today's event by making a donation today. A gift of any amount will have a direct impact on our work. Thank you, stay well, and join us again soon.